any books about factories or cars, so I've written a lot of introductions. And this is one I wrote for a book that was part of the Guggenheim Museum over there in Germany. Artist named Phoebe Washburn wrote this book and had a big visual collage thing called Regulated Fools Milk Meadow. And they asked me to write a sort of a piece that would describe, give a flavor of the inside of a factory. And this is how it went. Until the day I hired into the factory, I had a fair disdain for factory workers. Perhaps the main reason was that my father had been a factory worker. So had his father, and so had his father. Even as a small child, I wasn't too thrilled about this lackadaisical family trend. I'd been given a glimpse of the factory routine early on when my mother took me to the Fisher Body plant for a sanctioned visit of my father's workplace. Being that I was from Flint, Michigan, the birthplace of the automobile, I was accustomed to viewing these enormous plants that bulged upon the town landscape, but certainly never from the inside. As I watched my father on that day among a cluster of identical bolts between clusters of identical bins under a cluster of identical beams, I was struck by how insignificant he appeared, how small his hand looked as he raised to wave at us. He was merely one of hundreds of other solemn serfs, perhaps thousands, all wearing brown and all wearing down. No wonder my father never spoke about his job. Exactly what were these guys getting out of this? They were supposed to be building cars, but I couldn't spot a single one. How could a place be so enormous yet so claustrophobic at the same time? There wasn't even a window to be seen. Who the hell forgot the windows? Apart from seeing my father reduced to a less vexing stature, the thing that intrigued me most about the factory was how the assembly line curled, coiled, and wended throughout the plant. It went on, seemingly with no real plan. And no matter its course, the workers stuck by its side. They were like busy little appendages on a giant evolving snake. As the process rolled along, they poked at the snake, they pounded on it, they threw fire at it and clipped it with chrome. It was a bit difficult to tell whether they were giving assistance to the snake or trying to assassinate it. I wanted to follow the snake and see what became of it, but our guide broke us away from the line and back to the plant gate. My mother seemed especially glad to be leaving. I couldn't say I blamed her, for even a child clutching his mother's hand could have told you this was an obvious chump's bargain. I was more than confident I'd never be back. On the way to our car, I asked my mother, why were there no windows in there? She turned back toward the factory and studied it. Then she shrugged. There's probably a very good explanation, she said, her voice trailing off without offering one. Naturally, I wound up in the factory too. It turns out that the idealism of youth is a noble little fancy that crumbles fairly easily when introduced to the occupational realities of a gearhead town like Flint. It wasn't so much that no other options existed. It was more a case of pure ancestral gravity taking over, pulling me toward the DNA my clan had smeared from one wretched lever to the next, coaxing me to stick my head down the hole, daring me to resist the snake in its workaday wriggle. However, accepting your birthright is much different from embracing it. This is to say, I didn't get off to a real positive start at GM Truck and Bus. In fact, for the first few weeks, I was certain that I would quit at any given moment. And I don't mean just the job, I mean about right out of the human race. I found it difficult to get my bearings in a facility that was roughly 200 acres and employed 8,000 people. That sure seemed like a formidable amount of names to memorize for the water cooler routine. The truck and bus plant had its own fire station, its own security force, its own power plant. It even had its own shoe store. Conversely, how many shoe stores had factories inside them? Not many, I would assume. It took me 2 weeks before I could find with any regularity my own department. I would arrive at the plant an hour early just to search for my work area. Being a new hire, everything looked perplexingly identical. I couldn't distinguish even the most remote nuance about the place. Walls were walls, wires were wires, girders were girders. D.B. Cooper wasn't dead and Jimmy Hoffa wasn't missing. They probably just worked in here somewhere. Why not simply ask directions, you might ask? Well, are you completely daft? It was bad enough having the neon stigma of new hire emblazoned across my cheeks. To admit to a grizzled shop vet that I was lost and couldn't find my workbench would have been both unholy humiliation and a total career suicide. I might work there another 25 years and still not see an appreciable decline in the jeering quotient, nor the fierce rumors about my erstwhile testicular reduction surgery. I eventually figured out a route, and the key to it was the assembly line itself, the old snake. I would take a stairway, any stairway, up to the line. Once I had the snake in view, I would deduce what stage the truck building process was in by observing parts of the chassis that were either familiar or foreign to me. For instance, I would note if the trucks had doors attached. I knew that when the snake rode through my area, it had no doors. Thus, if I saw doors, this was a signal to backtrack the line instead of following its course. The snake would eventually shed enough unfamiliar items until I wound up in my department. As time went on, I adjusted to the size of the factory. In many ways, I reveled in it. Instead of dreading the prospect of getting lost, I came to invite it. There was something genuinely comforting about disappearing into the gray iron innards of the plant and stumbling upon regions that I'd never seen before. An exhilarating sense of invisibility would embrace me. In my opinion, there were few things as covetous to a nervous man in a gargantuan jungle than the perception that he was effectively indiscernible. Not much could go wrong after that. One of my favorite in-plant destinations was the final line. Here the trucks were on the verge of completion. Beautiful, shiny beasts in single-file splendor, poised to charge to life with an introductory spurt of gasoline. It was a rewarding view when compared to the one I had in cab shop and later on the rivet line. In cab shop, the trucks were still in embryonic form. Much like the disappointment I felt when visiting my father, I couldn't recognize the vehicles as vehicles yet. Visually, I wasn't sure if I was building a truck or a tractor or perhaps a giant toaster oven. I had a real envy for the guys that worked at the end of the final line. It seemed they were able to grab all the glory. Each time a truck would rev to life, one of those lucky suckers got to drive it off into the brilliant Michigan sunshine, heading toward the massive holding lot and ultimately the smitten hearts of the worldwide consumer. Speaking of sunshine, perhaps that was the strongest pull of the final line. Its cavernous opening in the west wall of the factory was the only part of the layout where you could catch any glimpse of the outside world. It was the old enigma of the windows again. What did GM have against transparent glass? Did studies show that workers perform better when deprived of daylight? Was enamel wall paint that much cheaper than Windex? Had those footprints under the sill been traced back to peeping Japanese auto agents? I remember getting nowhere when I asked a couple foremen about it. The disturbing part was that they reacted as if I were bringing up an entirely preposterous matter. One guy told me to utilize the company suggestion box. For a lot of foremen, this was their solution to everything. It's probably how they met their wives and decided what subdivision to nest in. The other foreman was just as useless. "Don't you have better things to worry about, Hamper?" he groaned. Well, apparently so. Within a couple years, I left the factory after a spate of messy breakdowns. There wasn't any one thing that seemed to cause this inglorious bobble of the ancestral baton. I'm fairly certain it wasn't a lack of windows any more than it was a lack of air conditioning or a fear of enormous snakes. Sometimes when your number's up, there isn't any real explanation. Get out and goodbye. I'm no longer in the factory, but a nice chunk still resides in me. That might explain this custom I have when I pay a visit back to Flint. Entering the expressway at Bristol Road, I drive a half-mile north. I pull to the side where I-75 begins to intersect with I-69. There's a large hill at this precarious site where I can overlook the guardrail and down upon the back lot of the GM truck and bus facility. And there they are, row upon row of gleaming mid-sized American trucks, immaculately parked butt to butt with their grills reflecting in the sunlight. If I look hard enough and far enough, I can spot the open western wall and see the industrial drip, the latest models charging off the line and out the door. It's still a total wonder to me. And from this vantage point, the sun is always at my back. And that's that.